When we speak of Mesoamerica, we immediately tend to think the Aztecs and Mayans. In reality, in Mexico and Central America combined, there were hundreds or possibly thousands of indigenous groups. The Aztec and Mayan were simply the most powerful of these branches. The society's values varied from who they were, but one thing stood the same for all. In Mesoamerican societies, sexuality and gender was not stigmatized in comparison to today.
We've heard a lot about where these children are going, but not as much about where they came from.
Where women are under siege. It's been called the most dangerous place on earth to be a woman.
Latin America has a huge homophobic killing problem.
When we think of gender, we think of men and women, but Mesoamericans had a very different subjective view of what gender was. They didn't look to a single person as a man or a woman, but rather as the warrior and non-warrior class. In various Mesoamerican societies, like the Maya, gods and goddesses were gender fluid. For example, the moon goddess, who was the goddess of fertility and sexuality, was seen as both a man and woman. In addition to the goddess of trash, Tlazolteotl would be depicted wearing both a skirt and loincloth in some paintings, which were designed to allude symbolically the presence of a penis. These goddesses were just some of the many deities that were gender ambiguous, and it is not uncommon for them to do so. The third gender is not actually a third gender. It is simply given that name to us so we attempt to understand sexuality and gender through our Western perspective. The third gender, which is given the name Bertachi, were men who dressed up as women and began to practice womanly norms in their culture, or vice versa, women who dressed up as men and did masculine social norms. The idea of sodomy, homosexuality, for men and women was practiced freely in Mesoamerica. Sex and homosexuality were practiced for two reasons. One was desire, and the other was for power. In Mesoamerican societies, and most precisely the Nahua tribe near central Mexico, saw the initiation of sex as a feminine activity. The Nahuan goddess, Tlazolteotl, signified sexual excess. Femininity controlled the sexual realm, so Nahua saw goddesses, women, feminine men, and animals as those who controlled sexual excess and moderation. Moderation was key. Those who engaged in moderate amounts of sexual activity were rewarded by the gods, but excess sex was punished with disease, death, and famine. While all this was occurring, a new set of beliefs was to arrive. Once the Spanish arrived, conflict was inevitable due to the drastically pessimistic view Spanish had on Mesoamerica, as well as the Spanish mission to obtain natural resources which forced the colonization of Latin America in a violent way, leaving compromises to never really occur. While the Spanish explored Mesoamerica, more specifically the Aztec Empire, they found gold. The Spanish began to extract the silver and gold found heavily throughout Mexico by enslaving the natives. Some indigenous communities began to commit mass suicide due to the harsh treatment of the Spanish imposed on them, even killing their own children to save them from the enslavement. The indigenous population shrank dramatically due to the Spanish and crimes. Within a century of the arrival of the Spanish, only 10% of the indigenous population was left. The Spanish brought African slaves to work along the remaining natives. The Spanish viewed the New World as a region controlled by the devil, and they came to save the land with the introduction of Catholicism. The natives, due to their taboo culture, were committing blasphemy in the eyes of the Spanish. The medieval Spanish ideologies of gender and sexuality introduced in the region set the origins of culture for Latin America today. God was the center of the culture for the Spanish. Spanish men heavily committed blasphemy during the colonial years. These men committed blasphemy in order to demonstrate their masculinity to show they did not fear God. Women were punished if they were to commit blasphemy. Women were seen as people who could not control their tongues and minds, needing a man to control them. A good wife was one who remained quiet and obeyed the church and their husband. In comparison to Mesoamerican society, medieval Spain used Catholicism to construct a strict culture which viewed gender in two notions, man and woman. The man was above women due to their interpretation of the Bible. Women were seen as individuals who were not capable of controlling themselves, therefore dependent on man. Unlike Mesoamerica, who allowed any type of sexuality in moderation, sodomy was punished to that of the law in medieval Spain. Heterosexual relationships were the only acceptable relationships to have. They were only acceptable when you were married. In contrast to Mesoamerican views, anyone who did not fit the heterosexual view of sexuality was essentially a puto. What caused the loss of these indigenous values in Mesoamerica? Many people automatically credit the role the Catholic Church played. What we found is a more nuanced explanation. The loss of the indigenous value and beliefs on sexuality and gender would be caused by the demographic decline in native people and the growth of a new race of people, the mestizo. In Latin America, a mestizo is a person of mixed race or the offspring of a Spaniard and an indigenous person.
That the Catholic Church mostly failed. It's really just daily interaction with people. What happens between the 17th century and the 19th century is that the indigenous population mixes more and more with the Spanish population.
Now, since the natives were the minority, they began to assimilate to the world around them, and this meant to become a mestizo. In a way, the church embodies the mestizo culture. Assimilation began with the cultural diffusion of those two worlds. Dia de los Muertos was constructed in order to make the assimilation process easier. Dia de los Muertos embodies both Catholic and Mesoamerican religion. The growth of the mestizos culture and assimilation of European values resulted in the new value of race, which placed the indigenous identities at the very bottom. Today, the word indio is used throughout Latin America as a disparaging comment. Que indio, or how Indian, is meant to insult somebody's appearance or culture. An extreme example of these racial values can be seen in the Guatemalan Civil War. During the Guatemalan Civil War, the dictator of the country was fighting the guerrillas. Efrain Rios Montt, a Guatemalan dictator, began to attack the indigenous population, arguing that they caused the harm to the country and supported the opposing team, the rebels. He ordered the soldiers to arrive at the native communities and kill the entire population. The soldiers would rape the women and murder the children, and this reveals how a new cultural value is present in the Latino population. Rather than attacking what tribe one was from, one begins to attack on race. The case of Maria Jose, Miss Honduras, and her sister Sofia Alvarado are an example of the present discrimination against women evolved from colonial times. Maria Jose was shot and killed shielding her sister Sofia. The shots came from Sofia's boyfriend, who committed the crime due to jealousy, after seeing Sofia dance with another man. This reveals a small portion of machismo culture, since the man is supposed to control a woman, to demonstrate and reveal how ruthless and fearless a man is of consequences. In the Latino community, homosexuality is rejected because of religious beliefs and inscribed feelings about sexuality. It is as well not ideal for a man to be gay. The lack of acceptance for homosexual individuals maintains their times with Spanish colonization. The impact of colonization has not just impacted Latin American society. Native American groups today have experienced similar effects of colonization.
Being a Native woman in Native culture is a very sacred thing. So a lot of the sacredness that women traditionally enjoyed has been destroyed by colonization. For most women's lives now are worse than probably any other women except in war zones. And from a certain point of view, I think of myself as living in a war zone as a Native woman. I never go anywhere by myself. It's really dangerous to do that.
Now it's time to alter the compromise that is the mestizo and acknowledge the other half. To learn good and the bad from the other half in order to end this machismo culture, which violates women's lives, and end the discrimination of LGBTQ+ community in Latin America. We're almost done with our public education, and we've never been taught Latin American history other than the arrival of Columbus. Our project reflects the importance of our history to understand the world around us and to reflect the present by learning from the past.